Hello and welcome. I'm Aiden, your narrator for tonight. I'm glad you found your way here. Take a breath, let your shoulders soften, and allow whatever the day brought you to begin quietly to release its hold. Tonight, I'll tell you a story called The Volcano's Secret, a tale set deep beneath the surface of a glowing sea, in a city of coral and current called Araluna, where a young marine biologist named Kai begins to hear something no one else has noticed. A trembling in the deep, slow and rhythmic, like breathing. What she finds beneath the city's oldest foundations is not danger, but something far more ancient. A loneliness as old as the ocean floor itself. This is a story of listening, of empathy, and of the quiet power that one voice can have when it speaks into the dark. Before we begin, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you tonight, and what brought you here? We'd also love to know what kinds of worlds you'd like to visit next. Leave a thought in the comments when you wake, and know that your ideas genuinely shape what we create. If you'd like to go a little deeper with us, our Patreon is a warm place to land. Early access to stories and quiet extras for those who want to be part of something closer. And if Terranash has found a place in your nights, a subscription is the simplest gift you can offer. It keeps this small world alive and means more than we can say. Now find a position that feels comfortable and still. Let your body grow heavy. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands go soft. With each breath out, release a little more of the day. With each breath in, let a little more quiet move through you. There's nowhere to be tonight. Nothing is required of you except to rest. When you're ready, let's go down together. Below the surface, below the light, to the warm and glowing deep where Araluna waits, and where an ancient voice has been hoping for a very long time that someone would finally come to listen. The city of Araluna existed in a kind of perpetual dusk. It sat on the floor of a deep coastal shelf, far enough from the surface that natural light arrived only as a faint and diffuse blue, like the memory of sky rather than sky itself. What lit the city instead was the life within it, the slow pulse of bioluminescent algae that coated every surface, the soft green lanterns that the inhabitants cultivated in their windowsills and gardens, the particular blue-white glow that drifted up from the thermal vents along the city's eastern boundary, where the crust of the ocean floor breathed out its warmth in steady, unhurried exhalations. Kai had grown up in Araluna. She had known its particular quality of light since she was small, since the days when she would press her face against the observation glass of her family's living quarters and watch the creatures of the open water drift past in the middle distance. Lanternfish trailing their pale lures, jellyfish folding and unfolding themselves with the patient logic of lungs, the occasional transit of something large and dark that she could feel more than see, a displacement of pressure against the glass that registered in her chest before it reached her understanding. She was 28 now, and she worked in the research station on the city's northern edge, where the coral formations gave way to open rock and the water moved differently, less sheltered, carrying more of the cold from the deeper shelf below. Her work was the kind that required patience. Long hours in observation chambers, notebooks filled with careful measurements, the gradual accumulation of data that would eventually mean something, though the meaning was never as immediate as the measuring. She had come to love this quality of her work, the way it asked her to be present without demanding urgency, the way it let her exist in the world of the water without consuming it, without requiring anything of it except attention. The tremors had started 6 weeks ago. They were subtle at first, a faint vibration through the soles of her feet while she walked the corridor between the station and the central plaza. A slight oscillation in the water in her observation tanks, enough to disturb the behavior of her specimens, but not enough to cause alarm. She had noted them in her log, assigned them the careful, neutral language she used for all anomalies: seismic activity, source undetermined, monitoring recommended. But the tremors had continued, and they had a quality to them that she found increasingly difficult to categorize. They were rhythmic, not the jagged, arrhythmic pulse of geological settling, not the creak and shift of plates adjusting their relationship to each other, which she had experienced twice in her time in Araluna, and recognized immediately as something sharp and aperiodic, unpredictable in the way that force acting on resistance is unpredictable. These tremors moved in long, slow waves. They had, and she had crossed this word out 3 times before allowing it to remain in her notebook, a quality of regularity that reminded her, involuntarily and uncomfortably, of breathing. She measured the interval on a Thursday morning, using the array terminal in her office. 17 seconds between peaks, consistent to within a fraction of a second, across every recording she could pull, going back the full 6 weeks since the first logged event. She sat with the number for a long time after she found it. 17 seconds, a long breath for something very large. The research station maintained a monitoring array along the southern approach to Araluna, a series of pressure sensors embedded in the sea floor at intervals of roughly 50 meters, extending from the city's outer wall to the edge of the volcanic shelf some 400 meters distant. The volcanic shelf was not, officially, a concern. The seamount that rose from it had been dormant for as long as anyone had been recording, its caldera long since sealed by the slow accretion of sediment and growth, its thermal activity reduced to the steady background warmth that fed Araluna's eastern vents. She pulled the array data for the past 6 weeks and spent 2 evenings analyzing it at the terminal in her small office, the glow of the screen mixing with the ambient blue-green of the corridor outside her window, casting the room in a color that had no name in the ordinary world. The results were unambiguous. The tremors originated from the seamount, not from the caldera, or rather, not from the structure she knew as the caldera, from deeper, from something underneath or within the seamount that the existing surveys had not captured, because no one had thought there was anything there that warranted detailed study. The seamount had always been characterized as a geological remnant, an old feature of the shelf architecture, interesting only insofar as it contributed to the thermal gradient that Araluna's engineers had built the city's heating system around. She looked at the array data for a long time. Then she looked at the geological survey that the station kept on file, which was 11 years old and had been conducted with equipment that, by current standards, was not particularly sensitive to the kind of low-frequency vibration she was tracking now. She filed a preliminary report that evening, kept deliberately brief, and went to bed feeling the particular restlessness of someone who has found not an answer, but a further question, and who knows that the further question is the one that actually matters. She lay in her bunk and listened to the city. The circulation systems moved water through the corridors in their steady, constant flow, a sound she had heard every night of her life at depth, and that registered in her sleeping mind as something close to white noise, a texture of sound rather than a sound itself. Beneath it, if she was still enough, she could feel the tremor. 17 seconds between each one, long, patient, old. She did not sleep well that night. The dive took 40 minutes. She went alone early in the morning shift. When the rest of the station's staff was occupied with the day's scheduled work and the observation corridors were quiet, she suited up in the equipment room, checked her tanks and instruments with the thoroughness her training had made automatic, and descended through the lock into the open water. The city fell away behind her. This was always the moment that she loved most about fieldwork. The transition from interior to exterior, from the contained and managed space of Araluna to the open and uncontained world of the sea. The water here had a quality that the city's treated water did not. A rawness, a variousness. The sense of it as a medium through which things moved and in which things lived that had nothing to do with human habitation. She moved through it with the careful, unhurried attention that the water required. The volcanic shelf resolved out of the blue ahead of her. She had been to the array before, many times, but she had never gone beyond it, had never had reason to. The seamount was visible from this distance as a dark mass rising from the floor, its lower slopes coated in the dense communities of organisms that colonize stable, rocky substrate, tube worms and crinoids, and the complex architectures of deep coral, soft and branching. Their feeders extended in the current. The upper slopes were different, bare rock swept clear by whatever gradients of current or chemistry existed in the water close to the seamount's surface. She descended toward it. The water changed as she approached. Not in temperature, or not only in temperature, though there was a warmth here that grew gradually as she descended, a warmth that was distinct from the background thermal gradient that felt directed. Personal was not the right word for what a geological feature could feel, but she noticed the warmth the way you notice a room that a person has recently left, not the person's presence exactly, but the evidence of it. The air that still holds the temperature of their body, the impression in the chair. She checked her instruments. The tremor was present, visible in the needle of the seismometer she carried, a faint and steady oscillation. 17 seconds, right on time. She found the opening 40 minutes into her approach, on the northern face of the seamount, at a depth she had not expected to reach in a single dive, but found herself at nonetheless, drawn downward by a quality of attention she could not fully articulate. The opening was a fissure in the rock, perhaps 2 meters wide, from which warm water moved in slow exhalations. Not hot, not the searing discharge of active hydrothermal venting, but warm in the way that a room is warm when someone has been living in it. A domestic warmth, the warmth of habitation. She stopped at the edge of the fissure and held still. The tremor was stronger here. She could feel it through her suit, through her feet and hands where they pressed against the rock, through the pressure of the water against her. The rhythm was unmistakable at this proximity. Long, slow, deeply, fundamentally regular. 17 seconds on the inhale. A pause. 17 seconds on the exhale. She turned off her lamp. In the dark, the seamount breathed. She could feel it as clearly as she had ever felt anything. The long, slow movement of the water inward and outward, the rhythm of something immense cycling through whatever constituted its respiration, its metabolism, its basic process of being alive. And the dark was not empty. At the edges of her perception, in the part of awareness that functions below the threshold of language, there was something, not a shape, not a form she could name, a quality of the dark that was different from the dark of open water, a presence that was warm and very old and attentive in a way that did not feel biological, but that was undeniably attention. She was being noticed. The realization arrived without alarm, just as a fact observed with the same careful neutrality she brought to all observations. Something in the dark was aware of her. She held still and let herself be aware in return. For a long time, nothing happened. Then the tremor shifted. It was subtle, the kind of shift she might have missed if she had not been paying exactly this quality of attention. A slight change in the interval, not longer, not shorter, different. The way a breathing pattern changes when the breather becomes conscious of being watched. She reached out her hand and pressed it against the warm rock at the edge of the fissure. The rock was smooth under her palm, not polished, not uniform, but worn in the way that very old things wear, the way stone becomes smooth, not through violence but through time, through the patient action of water over uncountable years, leaving a surface that holds a hand easily and that communicates. Through the palm, the warmth of the deep, and something else. Something that moved through stone the way music moves through walls, present, muffled, unmistakable. She held her hand there for a long time. When she finally turned on her lamp and checked her tanks, she had been at depth significantly longer than she had planned. She began her ascent and did not hurry. Above her, the city waited. Below her, in the warm and ancient dark, the seamount breathed on. She came back the next morning and the morning after that. She brought a portable speaker, something she used for ambient recordings in her office. She brought her notebook. She brought the kind of attention that her work had taught her to bring, to things that were slow and that required patience and that did not yield their meaning quickly. She sat at the opening of the fissure and she listened. The tremors, she began to understand, were not uniform. Within the overarching rhythm of the seamount's slow breathing, there were variations, subtle shifts in intensity, in frequency, in the particular quality of the vibration. She had been cataloging them as noise, as the random variation that any physical system produces around its mean. But the longer she sat and the more carefully she attended, the more she began to wonder if noise was the right word. The variations had pattern, not a simple repeating pattern, not the kind of pattern that a mechanism makes, which is the same interval reproduced indefinitely. A more complex pattern, a pattern that changed over time, that built and resolved and shifted and returned in ways that reminded her, with increasing insistence, of narrative, of stories, of the way that a long piece of music organizes its variations around a fundamental theme. She began to map the patterns in her notebook, not with numbers, or not only with numbers, but with the kind of descriptive notation she used for behavioral observations, for the cataloging of animal behavior in its full complexity. Long, slow passages that she labeled quiet, sections of increased activity that she labeled restless, moments of what she could only call urgency, a quickening in the tremors, a tightening, something that felt from the inside of the rock and water like a kind of reaching. On the fourth morning, she played a piece of music through the portable speaker, something soft and rhythmic, the kind she kept on a drive for long observation sessions. The tremors changed, not dramatically, but the rhythm shifted, briefly, subtly, in a way that rhymed with the music, a lengthening of the interval, a slight softening of the amplitude, something that sat in her body as she wrote this and crossed it out and wrote it again. Listening. She played it again. The same response, faint but unmistakable. She sat very still for a long time after the music ended. Then she opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote, in the careful hand she used for observations she was certain of. Responsive, aware, has been aware of the city for a long time, perhaps from the beginning. The tremors are not a threat. They are an attempt at communication. She did not tell her colleagues what she had found. Not yet. She needed to understand it first, or not understand it exactly, which was not the right word for what she was trying to do. Understanding implied analysis, translation into existing frameworks, the conversion of something new into something already known. What she was trying to do was different. She needed to be with it, to let it become real to her before she tried to translate it into the language of reports and findings and the rational mechanisms of institutional knowledge. She began to spend her evenings at the fissure as well as her mornings. The seamount was different at night, more present, more active. The tremors were more frequent in the later hours, the variations in their pattern more complex, more layered. She began to notice that the most active periods coincided with the late evening hours, with the time, she realized after several nights of observation, when the city above was quietest, when the circulation systems were at their lowest setting, and the corridors were empty, and the plaza was dark. It was listening to the city, she understood. It had always been listening to the city, and the city's nighttime quiet was when it could hear best, when the noise of human habitation dropped below whatever threshold its perception required, and the sounds of Araluna moved through the rock and water without interference. She thought about what it would hear, the hum of the circulation systems, the footsteps of the late shift workers moving between stations, the particular sonic signature of a community of human beings living their lives, eating and sleeping and talking and moving through the spaces they had built in the dark, far below the surface of the world. She thought about what that would sound like to something that had been here before any of that. Something that had sat in the dark and the warmth for millions of years, and had heard, at some point in the very recent past, a new sound beginning above it. The sound of a city taking shape, the sound of people moving in. Had it been frightening? Had it been welcome? She could not know. She could only sit at the edge of the fissure and hold her hand against the warm rock and feel, through the rock, whatever was there to feel. What she felt was something she would not write in her notebook for another 2 weeks, because it seemed too subjective, too far from the careful, neutral language her work required. What she felt was something that she had felt before, in her own life, at specific moments that she could enumerate. On the day she had left Araluna for the surface for the first time, looking back down at the city from above and feeling its smallness and its brightness against the dark. On the day her grandmother had died, sitting in the common room of the residential tower and understanding that someone who had always been present had stopped being present. On ordinary evenings, alone in her office, with the observation glass dark and the work finished and the city quiet around her. Loneliness. The particular kind of loneliness that has lasted long enough to become the furniture of a life. The loneliness that is not a state but a condition, that does not hope to be resolved but simply exists, patient and immense, like depth itself. It was on the 9th evening that she began to talk. She had not planned to. She had been sitting in her usual position, speaker playing softly, notebook open on her knee, in the reflexive habit of her work, though she had written nothing for the last hour. The seamount breathed around her. The water was warm. The dark was the particular deep dark of depth, which has no light in it at all. Not the absence of light, but the actual presence of darkness as a quality of its own. The kind of darkness that has weight and texture, and that you can feel slightly against the skin. She began to speak because the silence felt like something that wanted to be filled, and because she had, in 9 evenings of sitting here, developed a sense of the emotional state of whatever it was she was sitting with. Not a certainty. She would never claim certainty about something she had no framework for, but an intuition. The kind of intuition that her work had taught her to respect, that was not a substitute for evidence, but was frequently a reliable pointer toward where evidence would eventually be found. It felt lonely. She spoke quietly, the way she would speak to herself in her office, or to a specimen she was observing, or to the water itself on long, open water dives, when she needed the sound of her own voice to stay present. She did not know if the words were understood. She did not assume that they were. She spoke because it felt right to speak, because the darkness felt like it was listening, because the tremors shifted slightly when she did, softer, slower, settling into something that rhymed with the cadence of a human voice. She told it about Araluna. She described the city the way she would describe it to someone who had never seen it. The quality of the light, the particular blue-green pulse of the algae in the residential corridors, the way the thermal vents along the eastern wall warmed the water, so that certain species gathered there in the evenings, hovering in the warmth, the way creatures hover in warmth wherever they find it. She described the plaza at the center of the city, where the largest coral formation rose to a height of 6 meters and housed a community of organisms so dense and interrelated that it had been designated as a protected ecosystem within the city's own boundary, a small wilderness at the center of a human place. She described the observation glass in the research station's lower level, where you could watch the open water species moving in the middle distance and feel, without the barrier of the suit, the immediate weight of the sea above you. She described the quality of that weight, not crushing, not frightening, but present. The way the water makes itself known through glass. The way it is always there, in every room of the city, even in the rooms furthest from the outer wall, even in the most interior spaces, present as a pressure, as a temperature, as the sound that the circulation systems make when they process it and return it, changed to the sea. The tremors quieted as she spoke. Not entirely. The slow, fundamental rhythm persisted, as it always did. But the variations, the complex layering of secondary vibrations that she had come to associate with the seamount's more active states, smoothed and settled. The water around her took on the particular quality of stillness that she had noticed before, on her best evenings here, a deep, attentive quiet. She spoke for a long time. She told it about her own history, the years of training, the specific chain of decisions and circumstances that had led her to this work in this city, in this particular configuration of the seafloor. She told it about the creatures she had studied, the behaviors that still surprised her after years of observation, the the specific and small beauties that fieldwork brought you into contact with, the discoveries that were not grand enough to publish, but that mattered deeply to the person who made them. A cuttlefish, using a piece of debris as a shelter that no cuttlefish had been documented using before. A colony of polychaetes that had developed an asymmetric foraging pattern that she had watched for 6 months and never quite stopped marveling at. The particular quality of light on the sea floor at 4 in the morning, which was not different from the light at any other hour, in any measurable way, but that felt, nonetheless, like something specific to that time. A light that she associated with solitude and with the particular clarity that solitude produces. When she finally fell silent, the seamount was the quietest she had ever felt it. The fisher exhaled, long, slow, warm. She sat in the dark for a long time after, feeling the warmth of the rock through her palm, and feeling something else. The particular quality of being heard, not acknowledged exactly, not responded to in a language she could translate, but heard in the way that the presence of genuine attention can be felt even without evidence, even without proof. The way a room changes when someone truly pays attention to what you are saying. She came every evening after that. She brought new stories each time, not prepared, not written down, but drawn from whatever was available to her. Memories of her childhood in Araluna, the books she had read, the things her grandmother had told her about the city in its earlier years, when the residential towers were fewer and the plaza had been open ground, and you could, on a clear day when the currents were right, see the thermal plume from the eastern vents rising all the way to the city's upper boundary. She told it the old stories that circulated in Araluna about the great depths, the tales that mixed history and imagination the way all such stories do, that described creatures in the deeper water that no one had ever confirmed and no one had ever conclusively ruled out, that named the darkness beyond the shelf with the names that people had always given to the parts of the world they had not yet reached: the cold plain, the quiet dark, the deep that ends. She told it stories of the surface, which she had visited twice in her life, and which existed for her as a place of overwhelming sensation. She described what it felt like to cross the boundary from water to air for the first time, the sudden absence of weight, the sky arriving with no warning and no preparation, the particular quality of air against skin that was so different from water against skin that her body had spent several minutes simply not knowing what to do with the information. She described the horizon, that line where the surface of the water met the base of the sky, and how she had stood looking at it for a long time, feeling something that she could only describe as vertigo in reverse. Not the dizziness of looking down, but the dizziness of looking at something that had no limit. The seamount listened. The tremors settled when she spoke. The city above them, in the weeks that followed the start of her evening visits, stopped shaking. She noticed the absence of the tremors, or rather, she noticed when other people stopped noticing them. The faint vibration that had been the texture of the past 6 weeks had disappeared from the city's background, and people gradually stopped registering it, the way you stop registering a sound that has been present long enough to become part of the environment. Her colleagues attributed the change to natural variability. One proposed a hypothesis involving shifting pressure gradients in the shelf geology. Another suggested that the tremors had always been cyclical and were simply at the low end of their cycle. Kai listened to these explanations and said nothing. She was developing her own understanding of what the tremors had been. not geological, not cyclical in the geological sense, but something that operated on its own rhythm and by its own logic. Something that had intensified, not because the geological system was becoming more active, but because the presence above it had grown louder. Because the city had been expanding in the years before the tremors started, had been adding new residential towers and new infrastructure, had been generating more heat and more noise and more of the constant low-frequency vibration that human habitation produces. The seamount had been responding to that, not with alarm, not with threat, with the only form of communication available to something that had no voice, no surface to press against, no way to reach upward except through the slow and patient medium of the rock itself. It had been knocking. That was how she had come to think of it. Not knocking loudly, not with any intention to alarm or be heard necessarily, but knocking the way you knock on a door when you are not sure anyone is home, when you are not sure you will be welcome, when you are not even entirely sure what you want to say if someone opens it. Just presence. I am here. I have always been here. She told it one last story before she left on the evening of the festival. An old one her grandmother had told her when she was very small, sitting in the living quarters with the observation glass filled with night water and the distant glow of the thermal vents coloring the dark amber and gold. The story of how Araluna was founded, not the official account which she knew from the history records and which was a careful catalogue of engineering decisions and resource assessments and the gradual development of the technology that made deep habitation possible. The older version, the one that circulated in the residential corridors and had no official status, but persisted anyway in the way that true things persist, by being told and retold in quiet places, by passing from grandmother to grandchild, in the late hours when the city was quiet, and the glass was full of dark, and the only light was the light the sea made for itself. In this version, Araluna had been built not because it was practical to build a city here, at this depth, in this particular configuration of the sea floor. It had been built because someone, diving in the early years of deep water habitation, had felt something in this place, a warmth, a quality of presence, a sense that the ground here was not indifferent in the way that most of the seafloor was indifferent. The person had felt, in the language of the story, welcome. She had come back. She had brought others. Kai told the story slowly, the way her grandmother had told it, pausing in the right places, lingering over the details that mattered. The quality of the warmth, and the quality of the welcome, and the way the person had floated above the rock for a long time before ascending. Not because she could not leave, but because she did not want to. Because something in the dark and the warmth had felt, for the first time in a long, deep water dive, like a place she could stay. The seamount was very still while she told it. When she reached the end, the founding, the building, the gradual accumulation of the city above the rock, the fissure exhaled one long, slow breath, warm and mineral, and full of the particular quality she had come to associate with its most settled states. The tremor did not return. She sat for a long time in the aftermath of the story, in the silence that stories leave when they are finished, which is not the same as the silence that exists before they begin. A full silence, a completed silence. The ancient thing in the dark breathed on, slow and even, in the rhythm she had memorized over weeks of attendance. 17 seconds. The rhythm of something very large sleeping deeply. She pressed her palm against the warm rock one last time, Then she turned on her lamp and began the ascent. Above her, Araluna glowed. She could see it from a distance as she ascended. The congregation of light that marked the outer wall, the brighter nodes of the plaza and the station and the residential towers, the warm pulse of the algae along every surface, the festival lights still burning in the corridors of the city's heart, strung between the coral formations in long looping arcs, warm yellow and soft white, the kind of light that makes a place look like a place people love. It had the quality, from below, of something alive, not in the simple sense of being inhabited by living things, which it was, but in a deeper sense, the sense in which a place that has been lived in for a long time accumulates something that is more than the sum of its inhabitants, a warmth, a presence, the kind of thing that does not show up in any record and cannot be measured and does not need to be, because it is felt before it is known, in the soles of the feet on familiar floors, and in the particular quality of light that a specific place makes at a specific time of day. She rose through the water toward it. Below her, the seamount breathed. She could feel it even at this distance, the faint, slow rhythm, deeply calm now, the rhythm of deep and untroubled sleep. It moved through the water and up through the rock of the sea floor, and through the foundations of the city above, so faint now that only someone who had been paying the kind of attention she had been paying would feel it. A lullaby, she thought. That was what she had been telling all those evenings. Not stories, exactly, though they were stories too. Something older than stories. The thing that stories carry, when they are told with care and patience and the kind of love that does not require anything in return. The thing that calms the trembling dark. She arrived at the lock. She cycled through, unsealed her helmet, heard the familiar sounds of the city returning around her, the hum of the circulation systems, the distant sound of the festival, the particular ambient noise of a place full of living, breathing people, going about the business of their lives. She dried her face. She stood in the equipment room for a long time before she moved. In her small office, she opened her notebook to the first entry she had made about the tremors. Seismic activity, source undetermined, monitoring recommended, and read it over once. Then she turned to a new page. She sat for a long time before she wrote anything. What she finally wrote was not a scientific notation. It was not the language of reports or findings or the careful, neutral precision she had spent her career building. It was something older and simpler. The language that people use when they have encountered something they cannot fully explain and do not need to fully explain, when the encounter itself is the meaning, when the presence of a thing is more important than any description of it. She wrote, "It has been here since before we came. It let us stay." Below her, the rock held the warmth of the deep, and the slow rhythm of the seamount's breathing moved through the foundations of Araluna, very faint, very patient, barely perceptible, the way an old heartbeat sounds when you press your ear against the ground and hold perfectly still and let yourself hear what has always been there, beneath the noise of the present, carrying the city in its ancient and unhurried care. The festival lights burned on, the city hummed, and far below, in the warm and ancient dark, something old and vast and patient kept its slow and steady rhythm, dreaming in the dark, no longer alone.